A man with terminal cancer was abandoned by his wife and daughter. Months later, they came back for the inheritance and had no idea what was waiting for them. David had always been a man of methodical habits. At 52 years old, he was the owner of one of the city's most respected car dealerships, built with great effort over decades. His morning started early with a carefully planned routine that included a quick breakfast, a review of reports, and a daily visit to the showroom to ensure everything was in perfect order. He was a man who valued control and predictability, qualities that had led him to great success in business. But in recent weeks, something had changed. He felt strange, weak, without the same energy as before. Initially, he attributed the feeling to stress. After all, running a successful business wasn't easy. However, as the days passed, the weakness intensified, accompanied by a loss of appetite that worried him. Marta, his wife, insisted that he see a doctor, but David, as usual, resisted. He had always thought these things would pass with time, and the idea of wasting time on doctor visits bothered him. However, that particular morning, as he got out of bed, he felt such a strong dizziness that he had to lean on the dresser to avoid falling. It was a sign he could no longer ignore. With a growing sense of discomfort, he finally relented and scheduled an appointment with Dr. Rita, a family doctor who'd been taking care of his health for years. Dr. Rita's waiting room was welcoming, with light-colored walls and paintings depicting serene landscapes. David observed everything with a distracted gaze, trying to ignore the feeling that something was terribly wrong. When he was called in, he felt a shiver run down his spine. Dr. Rita greeted him with a cordial smile, but her expression quickly became more serious as David described his symptoms. She ordered a series of tests, and David, still reluctant, complied. He waited for the results with his characteristic impatience, but deep down, something told him this wait was different, and indeed, it was. Days later, sitting in the office again, David noticed the grave expression on Dr. Rita's face before she even said a word. The silence between them was heavy, almost palpable. The doctor took a deep breath and began to calmly explain what the tests had revealed. David heard the words cancer and terminal, as if they were coming from a distant place, as if they weren't directed at him. The explanation continued, but David could barely process what he was hearing. 6 months to live. How was that possible? He had always prided himself on his health, his vitality, and now, suddenly, he was confronted with his mortality in a brutal and inescapable way. Each word from Dr. Rita seemed to pierce his soul, pulling him away from the solid, secure ground he had always believed he stood on. When he finally left the office, the world seemed to have lost its colors. The streets he knew so well, the familiar faces, everything now seemed distant, almost unrecognizable. He drove back home in silence, without even turning on the radio, something he always did to relax. He needed to think, but his mind was in chaos. When he arrived home, he was greeted by Marta, who immediately noticed something was wrong. She asked what had happened, but David, still in shock, just murmured that he needed some time to process things. He retreated to his office where, surrounded by family photos and business awards, he began to confront the new reality that had been imposed on him. He remembered how he had built his dealership from scratch, the sacrifices he had made to ensure a comfortable future for his family. He remembered Amanda, his daughter, still a little girl, running through the dealership, fascinated by the cars. Now all of that seemed so insignificant in the face of the prospect that his time was running out. The following days were spent in deep introspection. David could barely eat or sleep. His mind revolved around a single question: how would he tell his family that he would no longer be there in a few months? How to face death when all he knew was life? The mere thought of seeing fear and sadness in Marta's and Amanda's eyes terrified him, And so, as the sun set on that quiet night, David realized that his greatest battle was yet to come. It wasn't against cancer, but against time and the unbearable weight of a future he couldn't control. The life he had built was about to change forever, and he knew that from now on, nothing would be the same. The morning was cold, and the heavy clouds in the sky seemed to reflect David's state of mind. After days of reflection and sleepless nights, he finally decided that it was time to tell his family about the diagnosis. The idea of revealing the truth terrified him, but he knew he couldn't hide it any longer. Marta was in the kitchen as usual, preparing breakfast with her habitual dedication. She was humming an old song, something she used to do when she was focused. David watched her for a moment, feeling a deep pain in his chest at the thought of the news he was about to share. He approached her, gently touching her shoulder. Marta turned to him, smiling, but soon noticed the seriousness in his gaze. "What's wrong, David? You look so down." "Marta, we need to talk." His voice sounded hoarse, as if the words were weighing heavily in his throat. Marta's smile faded. She sat down at the table, looking at her husband with growing concern. "What's going on? It's something serious, isn't it?" David nodded slowly, sitting beside her. "I went to the doctor, and the tests weren't good. I have cancer, Marta, and it's terminal. They've given me 6 months to live." For a moment, silence filled the kitchen. Marta blinked, as if trying to absorb what she had just heard. Her eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away, refusing to cry. "No, this can't be true. You've always been so strong, so healthy. There must be some mistake." David shook his head. "I wish it were a mistake, but it isn't. Dr. Rita was clear. There's no cure, no treatment that can save me. We just need to prepare for what's ahead." Marta felt a lump in her throat, but she forced herself to stay strong. She held David's hand firmly, looking into his eyes. "We'll get through this together. I'm here with you, David. I always will be." Those words, spoken with such conviction, brought some relief to David's heart. He knew the journey would be difficult, but hearing his wife's promise made him feel that he wouldn't be alone. "We need to tell Amanda," he said after a moment. "She needs to know." Marta agreed, but he could see the worry in her eyes. Amanda had always been a sensitive young woman, and dealing with something so serious could be devastating for her. Later that day, Amanda came home full of energy, as usual. When she saw her parents sitting on the couch, she immediately noticed that something was wrong. "Dad? Mom? What's going on?" she asked, a note of concern creeping into her voice. David asked her to sit down, and then, with the same difficulty he had with Marta, he told his daughter about his diagnosis. Amanda remained silent, her expression shifting from surprise to disbelief, and finally to sadness. Tears began to roll down her face as she shook her head, trying to deny what she was hearing. "No, Dad, this can't be. You're my hero. You can't be this sick," she said, her voice trembling. David held her hand, squeezing it gently. "I know it's hard, my love, but we'll get through this together. I need you now more than ever." Amanda threw herself into her father's arms, sobbing. "I promise I'll be here for you. We'll take care of you, Dad. No matter what happens, we won't abandon you." David hugged his daughter tightly, feeling the warmth of her love fill his heart. He knew that the future would be uncertain and painful, but at that moment, the unconditional support of his family gave him the strength he needed. The following days were marked by unity and affection. Marta took on the responsibility of caring for David, ensuring that he was comfortable and receiving everything he needed. Amanda, despite the initial shock, also dedicated herself to her father, spending more time at home and trying to keep the atmosphere as light as possible. They didn't talk much about the future, preferring to focus on the present and the moments they could share together. There was a silent pact between them to enjoy each day as if it were the last, and this pact brought a bit of peace to David's heart. David knew that the battle ahead would be tough, but with Marta and Amanda by his side, he felt ready to face whatever came. The promises of love and support were his safe harbor, and as long as they were by his side, he believed he could find the strength to face his greatest fight. David's physical deterioration was noticeable. Now, aware of his frailty, he began to notice small changes in Marta's and Amanda's behavior. In the days following the diagnosis, the promises of unconditional support began to give way to growing tension in the house. The presence of impending death, hovering like a shadow over everyone, was eroding the peace that once existed there. David started to feel more and more exhausted. The simplest tasks, like getting out of bed or walking to the living room, became exhausting. He still tried to maintain a calm demeanor, trying not to show how much the illness was progressing. But his efforts did not go unnoticed by Marta, who, instead of offering comfort, began to withdraw. She, who had always been by his side, now seemed distant, lost in her own thoughts. Marta's days became a routine of silence and distance. She avoided David's gaze, occupying herself with trivial tasks around the house, as if she were searching for an escape. When he tried to start a conversation about what they were going through, Marta responded with monosyllables or changed the subject. The coldness she displayed cut David more deeply than any physical pain he might feel. He tried to understand what was happening, but each attempt was met with an emotional barrier he couldn't overcome. Amanda's change was more abrupt. The young woman, who had initially promised to stand by her father's side, began to go out more often. At first, David thought she was just trying to cope with the situation in her own way, but over time, her outings became more frequent and prolonged. Amanda would come home late at night, often smelling of alcohol, her red eyes betraying nights of partying and excess. She barely spoke to her parents, preferring to isolate herself in her room when she was at home. David noticed his daughter's change in behavior with a mix of sadness and concern. He knew Amanda was struggling to face reality, but the way she chose to deal with it left him feeling even more lonely. He tried to approach her several times, trying to understand what was going on in her mind, but Amanda always deflected, saying that everything was fine, that she just needed some time to herself. Marta, on the other hand, seemed either not to notice or not to care about Amanda's behavior. She remained immersed in her own world, leaving David increasingly isolated. The moments when the family used to gather for dinner or watch television together became scarce. David often ate alone, listening to the oppressive silence of the house that had once been full of life. One night, after another of Amanda's long absences, David decided he could no longer ignore what was happening. When she arrived, visibly altered, he called her to talk. Sitting on the couch with a low and controlled voice, he asked why she was distancing herself so much. Amanda, with her eyes fixed on the floor, replied evasively, claiming that she needed space, that she couldn't bear to stay at home watching her father waste away. "I can't stand to see you like this, Dad. I don't know what to do, so I go out. I try to forget just for a while," she confessed, her voice choked with emotion. David, with a heavy heart, tried to explain that he understood her pain, but that he needed her, needed the daughter who had always supported him. However, Amanda, lost in her own anguish, abruptly got up and went to her room, leaving David alone in the living room once again. Marta's distancing was even more painful, as she remained physically close, but emotionally miles away. David tried to connect with her, but each time he approached, she seemed to pull away even more. Marta, who had always been the family's rock, now seemed to be crumbling inside, unable to deal with the reality of losing her husband. David's illness confronted her with her own mortality, and she didn't know how to process it. David's lonely nights became torment. Lying in bed next to Marta, he felt the distance between them like an abyss. He tossed and turned, trying to find a comfortable position, but the real pain came from knowing that the woman he loved was drifting away when he needed her the most. One night, he tried to express his feelings, but Marta simply turned to the other side, murmuring that she was tired and wanted to sleep. The silence in the house became deafening. David missed Amanda's laughter, the endless conversations he and Marta used to have about the future, the dreams they had shared for so long. Now everything seemed to have been swallowed up by the darkness of illness. Loneliness became a constant, suffocating presence. And David, who had always been a strong man, began to feel weak, not just in body but in soul. The only thing that seemed to bring some comfort were the memories of the happy moments they had shared together. He clung to these memories, trying to find in them the strength to carry on. But each passing day, the weight of loneliness grew, and David began to realize that despite the promises of support, he was increasingly alone on his journey. Marta's and Amanda's distancing was not just physical, it was emotional. And that distance, that disconnection, hurt more than any other aspect of the illness. David began to fear that in the end, what would kill him wouldn't be the cancer, but the abandonment by those he loved most. The days became long and lonely for David. With Marta and Amanda increasingly distant, he began to feel lost within his own home. The loneliness that enveloped him seemed unbearable, and the heavy silence that filled every room made his mind wander to dark places. However, amid this darkness, a small ray of light appeared in the form of Edward, his longtime friend. David and Edward had known each other since childhood. They grew up together in a humble neighborhood, spending their afternoons playing in the streets and dreaming of a better future. Life had taken them on different paths, but the friendship they had built never weakened. Edward had always admired David's success, but he never felt inferior for not having achieved the same level of prosperity. On the contrary, he was proud of his friend and had always been by his side through good and bad times. When Edward heard about David's health condition, he didn't hesitate to visit him frequently. He knew his friend was facing a tough battle and wanted to be there to offer the support David needed. To Edward, friendship was something sacred, and he wouldn't allow David to go through all that alone. Edward's visits became a relief for David. Each time Edward arrived, bringing with him his sincere smile and contagious energy, David felt his heart warm. They would sit in the living room or sometimes in the garden and talk for hours. Edward had a special talent for turning serious conversations into something light and pleasant, and this helped David forget, even if only temporarily, the gravity of his situation. "Do you remember that time we almost broke our legs trying to climb your neighbor's tree?" Edward would say, laughing as he recalled the days of mischief. David would laugh along, the pain in his body eased by the memory. "How could I forget? My mother was furious when she found out. I don't think we ever saw that guava tree again." These memories were a balm for David. He found himself transported to a simpler time when the biggest problems were school assignments or figuring out how to convince their parents to let them stay out later. It was as if, for a few moments, the illness didn't exist. Cancer wasn't the center of everything, but rather the enduring friendship and the stories they shared. In addition to Edward's visits, David also began receiving attention from Isabella, Edward's daughter. Isabella was a 19-year-old girl full of dreams, one of which was to become a nurse. However, the financial difficulties she faced with her widowed father had put that dream on hold. Despite this, she always had a natural instinct for taking care of others, and when she heard about David's condition, she decided to use her skills to help him. Isabella started visiting David along with Edward. At first, she just observed, helping with small tasks around the house, but soon she offered to take care of David more actively. She prepared his medications, checked his blood pressure, and was always ready to ensure he was comfortable. Isabella's dedication was remarkable, and David, who wasn't receiving this kind of care from his own family, felt deeply touched by the young woman's kindness. "You have the hands of an angel, Isabella," David would say, smiling as she adjusted his pillow or offered him a glass of water. "Thank you, Uncle David," she would reply, using the affectionate term she had always used to refer to him. "It's the least I can do for someone who has always been so important to my father and me." Isabella's presence brought David something he had lost, the feeling of being cared for, of being important to someone. She treated him with a sweetness that he no longer found in Marta or Amanda, and this began to brighten his days in a way he hadn't expected. The afternoon spent with Edward and Isabella became the highlight of David's week. They talked about everything, from childhood memories to the dreams Isabella still had of becoming a nurse. Edward, always the storyteller, made sure to remind David of the days when they had overcome so many challenges together. Isabella, in turn, listened attentively, as if every word David said was a valuable lesson. "I always knew you were made of something special, David," Edward said during one of the rare moments of seriousness. "It was never just about business or success. It was about never forgetting where you came from, and that's what makes you special." David, touched by his friend's words, felt a mix of gratitude and sadness. Grateful for having such a true friendship, but sad to realize that outside that circle, his life was falling apart. However, he decided to cling to the moments of joy that Edward and Isabella brought him. They were proof that even in darkness, there could still be light. As the weeks passed, the friendship with Edward and the care from Isabella became the foundation on which David leaned. Amid the distancing from his family, they were the only ones who truly stood by his side, not just in words, but in actions. And that made all the difference. Autumn had already arrived, bringing with it shorter days and colder nights. David's house, which had once been a warm and lively home, now seemed shrouded in silent sadness. The distancing of Marta and Amanda, which had subtly insinuated itself in the previous months, was about to culminate in something much more painful. In recent days, David had noticed that Marta was more distant than ever. She avoided staying in the same room as him, always finding an excuse to leave or occupy herself with some task. When their eyes met, there was an emptiness in hers, a reflection of a pain she couldn't express. Amanda, for her part, spent more time away from home, returning later and later and interacting as little as possible with her parents. David felt the weight of abandonment intensify. He had tried on several occasions to talk to Marta about what was happening, but she always dodged the conversation, changing the subject or saying she was tired. Amanda, when at home, kept herself locked in her room or quickly left to meet friends. The house that once echoed with laughter and conversations was now wrapped in an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional sound of the television or David's lonely footsteps. One night, after yet another failed attempt to talk to Marta, David lay in bed, feeling weaker than ever. The physical exhaustion was almost unbearable, but the emotional pain was even more intense. He knew something was wrong, that something deeper was corroding his family, but he didn't know how to fix it. All he could do was hope that somehow things would get better. The next morning, Marta finally made the decision she had been postponing for weeks. The weight of what she was about to do seemed to suffocate her, but she was convinced that she could no longer live that way. After breakfast, when Amanda was also at home, Marta called David to the living room. David felt his stomach churn as he headed to the living room. There was something in Marta's expression that made him realize this wouldn't be an ordinary conversation. He sat in his usual armchair and looked at Marta, who was standing with her arms crossed, a defensive posture he hadn't seen since the rare arguments of the past. "David, we need to talk," Marta began, her voice low and hesitant. Amanda was sitting on the couch, staring at the floor, unable to look her father in the eye. There was a tension in the air, dense like a storm about to form. David took a deep breath, trying to prepare himself for what was to come. "I don't know how to say this," Marta continued, her voice trembling. "But I just can't do this anymore. I can't watch you like this every day, wasting away slowly. It's too painful, David. It's killing me inside." David frowned, confused. "What are you trying to say, Marta?" Marta took a step forward, tears filling her eyes. "Amanda and I have decided we're going to move out. We can't stay here anymore, watching you suffer like this. I know it sounds cruel, but I just can't deal with it. We can't." For a moment, David's world stopped. He looked at Marta, then at Amanda, waiting for one of them to say it was a misunderstanding, a mistake. But their silence confirmed his worst fears. The shock turned into a sharp pain that seemed to tear his heart into pieces. "You're abandoning me." His voice came out weaker than he intended, betraying the enormity of the pain he felt. Amanda finally looked up, her eyes filled with guilt and sadness. "Dad, we don't want to hurt you, but this is destroying us too. I can't stand to see you like this. I don't know how to handle it." David felt a tightening in his chest. "I've always been there for you through every tough moment. I've always done what I could to protect and care for you. And now, when I need you the most, you're leaving me?" Marta began to cry openly, but did nothing to deny David's words. "I know it sounds terrible, but I'm at my limit, David. I can't be strong anymore. I can't pretend everything will be okay." David felt as if the ground was opening up beneath him. The people he loved most, the ones he had always trusted, were leaving. He couldn't believe that after everything they had been through together, Marta and Amanda were willing to let him face the last months of his life alone. Without further words, David simply closed his eyes, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. He wanted to scream, to beg them to stay, but he knew it was useless. The decision had already been made. Marta and Amanda, unable to cope with the suffering, had chosen the easier path, even if it meant abandoning him. "Do what you think is best," he finally said, his voice hoarse with sadness. "If you can't handle this, then I won't beg you to stay. Just take care of yourselves." Marta and Amanda left the room in silence, leaving David alone with his thoughts and his broken heart. The emptiness he felt now was unbearable. The promises of support, the vows never to abandon him, all had been broken. And now he found himself completely alone in the large house that had once been full of love and joy. In the days that followed, David watched as Marta and Amanda began to pack their things. He observed without saying a word as they slowly removed their presents from the house. Each box that was taken away seemed to carry a piece of what was left of his life. Marta, without looking at him, took care of everything mechanically, as if each gesture distanced her a little more from reality. Amanda, although clearly shaken, also avoided any direct confrontation, preferring to leave things unsaid. When the day of departure finally arrived, David stood at the entrance of the house, watching as Marta and Amanda loaded the last suitcases into the car. There was an uncomfortable silence between them, an absence of farewells that weighed more than any words. "Dad, I'm sorry," Amanda murmured before getting into the car. It was the only thing she could say. David just nodded, unable to trust his voice. When the car finally pulled away, he stood there until the sound of the engine faded into the distance. And at that moment, the reality of abandonment hit him with full force. The people he loved most had left, leaving him to face his final days alone. The pain he felt was not just physical, it was the pain of someone who had been left behind, of someone who found themselves deprived of any comfort or hope. David, now completely alone, finally let the tears fall down his face. Those he had thought would be by his side until the end had chosen the opposite path, and he didn't know how to move forward. In that moment, the house that had once been a refuge of happiness became a place of desolation, and David, sitting in the armchair in the living room, stared at the emptiness in front of him, trying to find the strength to face what was left of his life, even knowing he would be completely alone. The silence that settled in David's house after Marta and Amanda left was suffocating. Every room felt empty. Every corner carried the memories of the moments he had shared with his family. Loneliness was a constant companion, bringing with it a sense of helplessness that seemed to deepen every day. David, already weakened by the illness, felt his emotional strength draining away, as if the departure of the two people he loved most had drained what little was left of him. Edward, however, always attentive to his friend's condition, noticed that something was wrong. Edward and Isabella's visits were regular, and it was during one of these visits that Edward noticed the even heavier atmosphere in David's house. He knocked on the door as usual, but this time the delay in David opening it was longer than normal. When the door finally opened, Edward found David visibly weaker, his face pale and the deep circles under his eyes revealing sleepless nights. The weak smile David tried to muster couldn't hide the sadness he carried. Worried, Edward entered the house and immediately noticed the absence of Marta's and Amanda's suitcases, which were always there, ready for their frequent outings. "David, what happened?" Edward asked, the concern evident in his voice. "Where are Marta and Amanda?" David sighed deeply, feeling the weight of the response he was about to give. He knew Edward cared about him, but saying the words out loud made everything even more real and painful. "They left, Edward. They couldn't handle the situation. With my illness, they decided they couldn't stay here anymore." The silence that followed was filled with disbelief. Edward, always calm and measured, felt anger rise within him, mixed with deep sadness for his friend. He had known David since childhood, knew the generous heart he had, and it was unthinkable that someone could abandon him at such a critical moment. "They left you like this?" Edward finally asked, his voice low, trying to control his emotions. David just nodded, unable to say more. Words were unnecessary. The pain in David's eyes said it all. Isabella, who was accompanying her father, remained silent upon hearing the revelation. She had always admired David as a father figure and felt connected to him by bonds that went beyond the friendship between their parents. Seeing David in that state, abandoned and so clearly hurt, made her make a decision that had already been maturing in her heart. After a long silence, Edward made a firm decision. "David, you're not going to face this alone. Isabella and I are moving in here. We're going to take care of you." David looked at Edward, surprised. "Edward, I don't want to be a burden to anyone. You have your lives." Edward looked at David with determination in his eyes and said, "David, you've always been like a brother to me. After Catherine passed away, I was left alone with Isabella. It's just the two of us now. There's nothing that ties us to our place. Our life, our family, is small but strong. And we decided together that we want to be by your side. This isn't a sacrifice. It's a choice made by those who care. There's nothing more important to us than being here with you now." Isabella, who was standing by her father's side, nodded firmly. "Uncle David, we want to be here. I want to take care of you, to be present. It wouldn't make sense for us to stay away while you need support. You're part of our family too." David felt the tears well up in his eyes, but this time they weren't of sadness, but of gratitude. He had never expected anyone outside his own family to be willing to do so much for him. Edward and Isabella weren't just offering help. They were offering the love and support he thought he had lost forever. The move happened quickly. Edward and Isabella organized everything in a few days, bringing only the essentials to David's house. They turned the guest room into a comfortable space for Isabella, and Edward settled into the room next door to be close in case David needed anything during the night. The constant presence of Edward and Isabella in the house brought new energy to the place. Gradually, the oppressive silence gave way to occasional laughter and conversations about the days they had spent together, about the memories they shared. Edward, with his easygoing nature, always found a way to make David laugh, even when he felt his weakest. Isabella, with her sweetness and dedication, became the caregiver David never knew he needed. As the weeks passed, the bond between the three grew stronger. Edward and Isabella cared for David with a devotion he never imagined he would receive, and this brought immense emotional relief to him. Knowing that even in his final months of life he was surrounded by people who genuinely cared about him made the pain of abandonment by Marta and Amanda begin to heal, even if slowly. David, who had initially hesitated to accept help, now saw Edward and Isabella as his new family. They were by his side not out of obligation, but by choice, and that made all the difference. The house, once so lonely, was now full of life again, thanks to the presence of those who chose to stay. The nights, once long and lonely, were now filled with conversations that lasted for hours. Edward and David talked about life, about what they had lived through, and about what they hadn't. Isabella often participated in these conversations, listening attentively and learning from the experiences of the two men she admired so much. David knew that his time was running out, but unlike before, there was now peace in his heart. He knew he wasn't alone, that Edward and Isabella would be by his side until the end, and that gave him the strength to face each new day, despite the pain and exhaustion. Edward's and Isabella's move to his house was more than an act of compassion. It was an act of unconditional love that rescued David from the darkness that threatened to consume him. And for that, he felt deeply grateful, certain that despite everything, there was still hope and kindness in the world. The days became increasingly difficult for David. His health was deteriorating rapidly, and every movement seemed to require an effort he no longer had. The relentless disease was taking over his body, leaving him weaker by the day. Even with the constant support of Edward and Isabella, David knew that time was running out. In addition to the physical pain, there was another concern weighing on his mind: the cost of treatments. Although he knew nothing could cure him, palliative treatments and medical care were still necessary to ensure as much comfort as possible, and these costs were beginning to exceed his financial reserves. It was during a sleepless night that David made the most difficult decision of his life: to sell his car dealership. The dealership wasn't just a business, it was the symbol of everything he had achieved through hard work and determination. Seeing it pass into other hands would be like saying goodbye to an essential part of his identity. But David knew he had to do it. He didn't want to leave debts or financial problems for those who would stay after he was gone. The next morning he called Edward for a private conversation. Sitting in the living room, David explained his decision. "Edward, I need you to help me sell the dealership. I can no longer sustain the business, and the money will be necessary for care and, well, for what comes after." Edward, always a loyal friend, agreed to help without hesitation, but he couldn't hide the sadness in his eyes upon hearing David's decision. He knew how much the dealership meant to his friend. "Are you sure about this, David? I know this dealership means everything to you." David nodded, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's what needs to be done, but please don't tell Isabella the real reason for the sale. She already does so much for me. I don't want her to worry even more." Edward respected David's wish, and in the days that followed, he began to handle the paperwork for the sale of the dealership. David, for his part, avoided thinking too much about it, but with each signature on a document, He felt as if he were closing an important chapter of his life. When the sale was finally completed, David looked at the dealership for the last time, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. He had given his best to that place, but now it was time to move on, even if it meant leaving behind something he loved so much. The decision to sell the dealership wasn't easy, but David knew it was the right choice. With the money from the sale, he could ensure that his last weeks would be as comfortable as possible and that he wouldn't leave a financial burden for those he loved. As he drove home with Edward, David felt a weight lifted from his shoulders. There was sadness in saying goodbye to the dealership, but there was also a sense that he had done what needed to be done. Now he could focus on what really mattered, enjoying the time that remained with those who had chosen to stay by his side. David knew that time was running out. Every day the disease consumed him a little more, and he felt that he needed to resolve the issues that still concerned him. Among them, one weighed most heavily on his mind, ensuring that after his departure, his last wishes would be respected. One day, with the determination of someone who still had a purpose, David asked Edward to take him to the office of his trusted lawyer, Dr. Lewis. Although Edward wanted to accompany him to the end, David insisted on going alone. "I need to handle this personally, my friend," he said, with a firmness that Edward respected. Lewis's office was a calm environment, contrasting with the storm of emotions that David carried. Sitting in front of the lawyer, David began to talk about his concerns. He mentioned the changes in his life, the distancing of Marta and Amanda, and the unconditional support he had received from Edward and Isabella in recent months. Lewis, who knew his client well, listened attentively, taking note of every detail. He understood the seriousness of the moment for David and made sure to ensure that all his wishes were recorded accurately. With everything prepared, David picked up the pen and with trembling hands signed the document. It was an act that brought a sense of closure, but also relief. He knew he was doing what was right, even though it was a difficult decision. Before leaving, David looked at Lewis and, with a serene tone, asked him to take care of everything when the time came. Lewis nodded, committing to ensuring that David's last wishes would be respected without question. When David left the office and rejoined Edward outside, he felt strangely at peace. There was no need to share the details of what he had done. The most important thing was that now he could focus on enjoying the time he still had with the people who truly mattered. David's final days were marked by an unexpected serenity. The physical pain, though constant, seemed less important in the face of the peace he had found alongside Edward and Isabella. They cared for him with a dedication that went beyond simple duty. It was genuine love, a true friendship that grew stronger with each passing day. David knew the end was near. He felt his body weakening, and the strength that once fought against the disease was now beginning to give way. Even so, he was at peace. The nights were spent in quiet conversations or in comfortable silence, with Edward and Isabella by his side. There was nothing more to fear. He had made the necessary decisions, and now he was just waiting for the inevitable moment. One morning at dawn, David took his last breath. Edward was by his side, holding his hand, while Isabella cried silently. The moment was solemn, marked by a mix of deep sadness and gratitude for having been able to be with him until the end. David passed away in peace, surrounded by the only people who had truly remained by his side. The news of David's death quickly spread. Marta and Amanda, who had distanced themselves, heard about it soon after and decided to return. For them, David's death represented an opportunity to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. The weight of regret and guilt was present, but the prospect of an inheritance seemed to overshadow any genuine remorse. When Marta and Amanda arrived at the house they had once called home, they were met by Edward. He was waiting for them at the entrance, his expression serious and resolute. There was no anger in his eyes, but a firmness that indicated he was prepared for what was to come. "You came back," Edward said without surprise in his voice. Marta tried to maintain her composure, but there was evident nervousness in her gestures. "We came to settle things. We're David's family, and we have a right to what he left behind." Amanda, standing next to her mother, avoided looking directly at Edward. There was a weight on her shoulders, a mix of shame and regret for having abandoned her father in his most difficult moments. Edward remained calm. "David knew you would return. He foresaw this and took his precautions. Before he passed, he made sure to take care of everything so that his wishes would be respected." Edward's words hung in the air like a sentence. Marta and Amanda were silent, trying to process what this meant. There was no going back. There was no undoing the abandonment they had imposed on David. And now they were facing a man who had his friends' trust to ensure that his last will would be fulfilled. "David left clear instructions," Edward continued, his voice firm but without aggression. "You will have the chance to hear everything when we go to the lawyer, but know that he didn't forget what happened in the last few months." Marta felt the impact of those words like a blow. She knew that abandoning David would be something difficult to forgive, but she hadn't expected him to be so clear in his decision. Amanda, for her part, couldn't hold back the tears now freely flowing down her face. "I'm so sorry," Amanda whispered, her voice broken by guilt. "I know I was wrong, but it's too late to change that." Edward observed the young woman, understanding that despite the regret, past actions couldn't be erased. "What's done is done, Amanda, but David's choices reflect what he felt in his final days." The atmosphere was thick with tension as Edward, Marta and Amanda remained silent, each lost in their own thoughts. What remained now was to face what David had decided for the future of all of them. The day of David's will reading finally arrived. In Dr. Lewis's office, the atmosphere was heavy with expectation and tension. Marta and Amanda sat side by side, trying to maintain their composure, though the nervousness was evident. Edward and Isabella sat on the other side of the room, silently awaiting what was to come. Lewis, with a neutral expression, organized the papers on his desk. When everyone was ready, Lewis began reading the document that David had signed just a few weeks before his death. His voice was calm, but each word carried an emotional weight that was felt by everyone present. "This will reflect the last wishes of David Almeida, written and signed in my presence," Lewis began, as everyone in the room held their breath. As the reading progressed, it became clear that David had used the will to express his deepest feelings. He spoke of the love he had always had for his family, but also of the pain he felt at being abandoned in the moments when he most needed support. His words were direct, without bitterness, but with a clarity that left Marta and Amanda visibly uncomfortable. David made it clear that despite everything, he wished for each of you to find peace and move on with your lives, Lewis said, pausing for a moment before continuing. However, he made decisions that reflect the reality of what he experienced in his final months. When he reached the part about the distribution of assets, Lewis announced that David's entire fortune, including the house and the proceeds from the sale of the dealership, would be inherited by Edward and Isabella. He described the care and loyalty that Edward and Isabella had shown and how David, in gratitude, wanted to secure their future. Marta, upon hearing that she had been completely excluded from the inheritance, remained silent, her face pale. There was a mix of shock and sadness in her eyes, but also a silent acceptance of what had happened. She knew that her actions had consequences, and now she was facing them. Amanda, on the other hand, couldn't hold back her tears. She felt the regret weigh like a stone on her chest. David's words, read by the lawyer, echoed in her mind, each one a painful reminder of the mistake she had made. Realizing that her father, even loving her, had felt the need to protect his inheritance from his own daughter, was a bitter lesson. Lewis continued, explaining that David had left a small sum of money to Amanda, a sort of last attempt to ensure that she would have something to start over. But the gesture, though kind, was a reminder of how much she had lost by distancing herself from her father. Edward and Isabella, on the other hand, received the news with humility and sadness. They knew that the inheritance David had left was a symbol of his gratitude and love, but also a responsibility. They had lost a dear friend, someone they considered family, and no amount of money could fill the void David had left. After the reading, Lewis closed the will and looked at everyone in the room. David was very clear in his decisions. He wanted you all to know that his choices were based on what he experienced. Now it's up to each of you to move forward, honoring the legacy he left. The room remained silent for a few moments. Marta and Amanda were the first to leave, without saying a word. Marta, her face closed off, was lost in thought while Amanda cried silently, realizing that her late regret couldn't change the past. Edward and Isabella stayed behind, thanking Lewis for his care with David's wishes. As they left the office, Edward placed a loving hand on his daughter's shoulder. "We'll honor David's memory the way he would have wanted," he said in a soft but firm tone. Isabella nodded, feeling the responsibility and privilege of continuing life with the support that David had ensured. In the following months, everyone's lives changed profoundly. Isabella finally had the opportunity to pursue her dream of becoming a nurse, and she did so with renewed vigor, determined to honor the gift David had given her. Edward, for his part, dedicated himself to keeping his friend's memory alive. He visited David's grave regularly, bringing flowers and talking to him as if he were there, reminiscing about the good memories and thanking him for everything. Marta and Amanda faced the consequences of their actions. Marta, now alone, began to live with the choices she had made, reflecting daily on what could have been different. Amanda, on the other hand, embarked on a journey of self-discovery and redemption, carrying with her the regret of having abandoned her father, but determined to live in a way that honored David's memory. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought about the story. See you